In the dark pine forests of Georgia in 1843, where humidity hung thick as guilt and secrets grew as tall as the long-leaf pines that covered the red clay hills, there existed a plantation that would become the center of a scandal so devastating it required the cooperation of 3 county sheriffs and 2 judges to suppress. The Blackwood estate, with its modest but elegant main house and reputation for strict order maintained by military precision, seemed an unlikely setting for events that would challenge every assumption Georgian society held about race, fidelity, and the security of their social structure. When Colonel Harrison Blackwood returned from 2 years of military service in the Creek territories to find his wife 6 months pregnant with a child that couldn't possibly be his, he believed initially that he faced a simple case of adultery, shameful but manageable within the bounds of their social class. What he discovered instead was something that defied his comprehension and threatened not just his family but the foundational assumptions of slave society itself. In a single terrible week in October 1843, an investigation that began with one woman's infidelity uncovered a web of relationships spanning 2 years, involving 5 different enslaved men, producing 3 mixed-race children, and revealing that the rigid lines supposedly separating masters from slaves were far more permeable than anyone wanted to admit. This is the story of Catherine Blackwood, a woman who violated her society's most sacred taboos, the 5 enslaved men who paid the ultimate price for her transgressions, and the systematic violence that followed when power felt threatened by evidence of its own instability. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if this is your first time on our channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that official history worked desperately to erase. The Blackwood plantation occupied 1,200 acres of prime cotton land in central Georgia, its fields producing moderate yields that sustained a comfortable but not extravagant lifestyle for the family. Colonel Harrison Blackwood had inherited the property from his father in 1835 at age 30, bringing to its management the military discipline he had learned during his service in Georgia's volunteer regiments. Harrison was everything Georgian society valued in a planter and officer. Tall and commanding in bearing, stern but fair in his dealings, a man who believed deeply in honor, duty, and the natural order of society that placed white men like himself at the apex of civilization. His slaves numbered 47 in total, a mix of field hands and house servants managed by an overseer named Jeremiah Stone, a hard man who believed that strict discipline and swift punishment for infractions kept the slave system functioning efficiently. The plantation ran with military precision under Harrison's supervision, work schedules maintained to the minute, infractions addressed immediately, rewards and punishments dispensed according to clear rules that slaves learned quickly or suffered for not learning. Catherine Hayes had married Harrison Blackwood in 1837 when she was 19, and he was 32, a typical age difference for their class where young women married established men who could provide appropriate social standing. Catherine came from a prominent but cash-poor Savannah family, her marriage to Harrison representing a strategic alliance that gave her financial security and gave him connections to Georgia's coastal elite. By all external appearances, it was a successful match, producing 2 children in the first 3 years and maintaining the social performances that defined their class. But Catherine had always been different from other plantation mistresses in ways that would eventually prove catastrophic, restless, curious, prone to reading books that her mother-in-law considered inappropriate for ladies, and most dangerously, possessing ideas about human nature that didn't align with the rigid racial hierarchies of slave society. In the spring of 1841, Harrison received orders to join a military expedition to Creek territories in what is now Alabama, a 2-year deployment that would take him away from the plantation for an extended period. He left in April, placing the estate's management in the hands of Overseer Stone and trusting Catherine to supervise household operations and maintain appropriate social relations with neighboring plantations. For the first 6 months of Harrison's absence, Catherine fulfilled her duties exactly as expected, managing house slaves, overseeing food production, maintaining correspondence with her husband through irregular military posts, and participating in the reduced social life available to a woman whose husband was away on military service. But gradually, Catherine's isolation and her natural curiosity about the human beings her society insisted she think of as property combined to create a situation that would destroy her family and end multiple lives. It began with conversations. Catherine had always been more engaged with house slaves than was typical for mistresses of her class, asking them about their lives, their families, their thoughts about events on the plantation. Most slaves recognized these conversations as dangerous and responded with careful deference, giving answers that satisfied without revealing anything genuine. But one slave, a man named Samuel who worked as a carpenter and general maintenance worker around the main house, was less skilled at maintaining protective distance. And in his willingness to engage more authentically with Catherine's questions, he became the first of 5 men who would be drawn into a situation none of them wanted, and from which none would survive. Samuel was 28 years old in 1841, literate due to previous ownership by a master who had believed in educating his slaves, and possessing a natural intelligence that made him valuable for skilled work requiring problem-solving and planning. Catherine noticed him initially because of his work on the main house, repairs to windows and doors that brought him into proximity with her living spaces, and she found herself engaging him in conversations that went beyond simple instructions about work tasks. These conversations were innocent initially, discussions about books Samuel had read, his opinions on events Catherine learned about through newspapers, his observations about plantation life. But gradually, over months, the conversations became more personal, more intimate, and by autumn of 1841, Catherine and Samuel had crossed lines that Georgian society considered absolutely inviolable. What began as a single terrible choice would escalate over the following 2 years into something much worse as Catherine found herself drawn into increasingly reckless behavior with multiple enslaved men from the plantation. The second relationship began in early 1842 with Marcus, a field slave who occasionally worked in the main house garden and who caught Catherine's attention during one of her increasingly frequent walks around the plantation grounds. Marcus was younger than Samuel, only 22, and unlike the older carpenter, he was terrified of the situation into which Catherine was drawing him. He tried to maintain distance, but Catherine held absolute power, and when she made clear that resistance would result in him being sold away to the brutal conditions of the Deep South cotton plantations, Marcus understood he had no choice. Slaves could not refuse masters, could not say no to any demand, and when a white woman with power over his life insisted on intimacy, the only option was compliance and prayer that the situation wouldn't end in his death. By mid-1842, Catherine was simultaneously involved with Samuel and Marcus, a situation that would have been unimaginable to anyone who knew her as a respectable plantation mistress. But she had convinced herself through elaborate rationalizations borrowed from abolitionist literature she secretly read that what she was doing was somehow rebellious, a rejection of oppressive social structures, evidence of her progressive thinking about human equality. She never acknowledged even to herself that the relationships were built entirely on coercion, that slaves could not consent to intimacy with masters who held absolute power over them, that what she believed was connection was actually exploitation of people who had no ability to refuse her without facing severe punishment or death. The third relationship began with Jacob, a house servant who worked in the kitchen and occasionally served meals when Catherine dined alone during Harrison's absence. The fourth with Thomas, another carpenter who worked alongside Samuel. And the fifth with Benjamin, a stable hand whose work brought him to the main house multiple times daily. Catherine seemed driven by increasingly reckless compulsion, unable or unwilling to recognize the danger she was creating for herself and especially for the men she was involving in her transgressions. By the summer of 1843, Catherine was pregnant, a condition she could no longer conceal, and that represented a crisis of unprecedented magnitude. She didn't know with certainty which of the 5 men had fathered the child she carried, though she suspected it was Samuel based on timing, But what she did know was that when the baby was born, its appearance would likely reveal its father's race, and that revelation would trigger consequences she had somehow managed to avoid contemplating during 2 years of increasingly destructive behavior. Catherine considered various desperate plans, attempting to induce miscarriage through herbal preparations, though she couldn't bring herself to actually consume the dangerous concoctions. Claiming the child was Harrison's from a brief visit home that had never occurred, fleeing to the north and attempting to pass as a widow. But each plan seemed more impossible than the last, and as summer turned to autumn and her pregnancy advanced, she found herself simply hoping that some intervention would save her from facing the consequences of her actions. Colonel Harrison Blackwood returned to his plantation in October 1843. His military deployment concluded earlier than expected due to successful resolution of the creek situation. He arrived home dusty from 3 days of riding, expecting a joyful reunion with his wife and children, eager to resume his life as planter and family patriarch. What he found instead was Catherine visibly pregnant with a child that couldn't possibly be his, and in that moment of discovery, his world collapsed with a completeness that nothing in his military service had prepared him to handle. Harrison's first assumption, the only one his mind could initially process, was that Catherine had taken a white lover during his absence, likely one of the neighboring planters, or perhaps an overseer from another property. This betrayal was devastating to his honor, and his rage was immediate and terrible to witness, but it was still a crisis he understood, a violation of marital fidelity that fit within his comprehension of human behavior. He demanded Catherine name her lover immediately, promising that while he would divorce her and ruin her reputation, he would spare her life if she confessed everything. Catherine's response was silence, a quiet refusal to name anyone, accompanied by tears and what appeared to be genuine shame, but no explanation that Harrison could accept or even understand. Over the following week, Harrison conducted an investigation with the same systematic approach he brought to military planning. He questioned every white man who had visited the plantation during his absence, confronted his overseer about any suspicious visitors, interviewed house slaves about who Catherine had spent time with, searching desperately for a white man he could identify as responsible for his wife's pregnancy. What he found instead, pieced together through reluctant testimony from terrified slaves who understood their answers, would lead to deaths, but couldn't lie convincingly enough to deceive a determined interrogator, was something far worse than adultery between social equals. His wife had spent 2 years conducting relationships with 5 different enslaved men, producing not just the pregnancy he could see, but also, as it emerged through further investigation, 2 other children already born who had been living in the slave quarters, identified as the children of enslaved mothers, but bearing features that now, viewed with suspicion, revealed their actual parentage. Harrison's response, when he finally understood the full scope of what Catherine had done, was a mixture of rage, horror, and desperate need to restore order to a situation that threatened everything he believed about race, slavery, and social stability. He ordered the 5 men, Samuel, Marcus, Jacob, Thomas, and Benjamin, locked in the plantation's slave jail, a small building where recalcitrant slaves were temporarily confined before punishment or sale. He sent for 2 neighboring planters whose discretion he trusted, Edward Morrison and William Crawford, both men who understood that what had happened on the Blackwood plantation threatened not just Harrison's family, but the entire social order of Georgian slave society. The 3 men met in Harrison's study for an entire night, drinking whiskey and discussing how to handle a crisis that had no precedent in their experience and could not be allowed to become public knowledge. What Catherine had done violated every taboo of slave society, not because infidelity was uncommon. White men routinely forced enslaved women into sexual relationships, but because she had inverted the power dynamic in ways that suggested white women could choose black men over white men, that the racial hierarchy supposedly rooted in nature was actually fragile and permeable. If other white women learned that Catherine had done this, if slaves learned that such relationships were possible, the entire justification for slavery, That racial difference made it natural for whites to rule over blacks would be revealed as the constructed lie it had always been. The solution the three planters arrived at was brutal and methodical, designed to erase evidence, silence witnesses, and restore through violence the sense of absolute white supremacy that Catherine's actions had threatened. The 5 enslaved men would be killed immediately, not through any legal process which would create public records, but through plantation justice that left no documentation. Catherine would be quietly committed to a private asylum far from Georgia, her children taken away, her existence effectively erased from Blackwood family history. The 2 mixed-race children already born would be killed, their deaths attributed to disease or accident, their existence wiped from plantation records. And every slave on the Blackwood plantation and the 2 neighboring properties would be assembled to witness the punishment of the 5 men. A demonstration of absolute white power meant to terrify anyone who might have thoughts of crossing racial lines. The executions occurred on October 24, 1843, in a clearing near the slave quarters where all 47 Blackwood slaves and approximately 60 slaves from the Morrison and Crawford plantations were forced to watch. The 5 men were brought from the slave jail, their hands bound, and without any pretense of trial or explanation, were hanged from an ancient oak tree while slaves were ordered to watch and understand what happened to any black man who touched a white woman, regardless of circumstances or coercion. Samuel died first, his literacy and intelligence making him the primary target of Harrison's rage, followed by Marcus, Jacob, Thomas, and Benjamin, each killing deliberate and public, meant to be witnessed and remembered and recounted as a warning to every enslaved person in 3 counties. The slave witnesses stood in forced silence, forbidden to look away or show any reaction beyond fear, understanding that any expression of grief or anger would result in their own punishment. When the executions were complete, Harrison addressed the assembled slaves personally, explaining that these men had committed an unforgivable crime against nature itself, that their punishment was not just deserved but merciful compared to what they should have received, and that any slave who ever spoke about what had happened here would join them hanging from that oak tree. The trauma of forced witness was deliberate, a psychological assault meant to reinforce through terror the racial hierarchy that Catherine's actions had threatened. Catherine watched the executions from an upper window of the main house, held there by 2 women from Morrison's plantation who had been brought specifically to ensure she witnessed the consequences of her actions. She collapsed during the final execution and was carried to her room, where she remained under guard for the following week until arrangements for her institutionalization could be finalized. The 2 mixed-race children, living in the slave quarters and unaware of their true parentage, were killed that same night through methods the historical record deliberately leaves vague, their small bodies buried in unmarked graves somewhere on the plantation's boundaries, their existence erased from every document that mentioned them. Catherine was transported to a private asylum in Virginia in early November, officially diagnosed with severe hysteria and moral insanity, conditions that her doctors attributed to the strains of childbirth and isolation rather than to her actual behavior, the truth about which was deliberately concealed from medical records to protect the family's reputation. She remained institutionalized for 12 years, during which time she gave birth to the child she had been carrying, a baby girl who was immediately taken away and whose fate remains unknown, possibly adopted by a family far from Georgia, possibly killed like her half-siblings, the historical record again leaving deliberate gaps. Catherine was released from the asylum in 1855, technically cured but actually broken, returning to her family in Savannah where she lived another 30 years as a recluse, never speaking publicly about the years between 1841 and 1843, never mentioning the 5 men whose deaths resulted from her actions. Her story erased so completely that later generations of the Blackwood family had no knowledge of the scandal that had nearly destroyed their name. Colonel Harrison Blackwood never remarried, though he was only 38 when Catherine was committed and certainly had opportunities to do so. He continued operating the plantation until his death in 1876. Running it with the same military precision as before, but with a new reputation for harshness that made even other slaveholders comment on his severity. The oak tree where the 5 men were hanged remained standing until 1923, when it was finally cut down by the property's then owners, but its stump was visible for decades afterward, and older residents of the area who knew the story would point it out to younger generations as a reminder of what happened when proper order was violated. The Morrison and Crawford families, whose cooperation had been essential to suppressing the scandal, maintained silence about the events of 1843, but rumors circulated nonetheless through slave communities, and eventually into white society, as whispered speculation about something terrible that had happened at the Blackwood plantation. The truth was never officially confirmed, allowing the families to deny everything while simultaneously benefiting from a reputation for swift punishment of any threat to racial hierarchy. Over time, the story became one of those Southern Gothic legends that everyone had heard some version of, but whose details were too disturbing and threatening to social order to be openly discussed. The 5 men who died, Samuel, Marcus, Jacob, Thomas, and Benjamin, left no individual records of their existence beyond plantation ledgers that listed them as property and noted their deaths as financial losses. Samuel had been valued at $800, Marcus at $1,000 as a young and strong field worker, Jacob at $600, Thomas at $750, and Benjamin at $650, and those valuations were the only memorials they received in official records. They had no graves with markers, no obituaries, no acknowledgement of their humanity beyond the property claims that Georgia law allowed Harrison Blackwood to file for compensation from Catherine's family for the loss of their value. Their death served their intended purpose as terror and warning, but also became something more through the slave oral tradition that preserved their story and the true nature of what had happened. In the quarters, in whispered conversations that masters could never completely suppress, the story was told and retold across generations, becoming a cautionary tale about the specific dangers faced by enslaved men who attracted the attention of white women, about the impossibility of consent under slavery, and about the systematic violence that maintained racial hierarchy. The story challenged the prevailing narrative that sexual relationships crossing racial lines represented black male aggression against white female purity, revealing instead a more complex and disturbing reality where white women could use their power to coerce enslaved men into relationships that would then be punished as if the men had been the aggressors. And through the preservation of this story in oral tradition, the 5 men achieved a memorial that official records denied them, becoming symbols of slavery's fundamental injustice. The way it placed enslaved people in impossible situations where they could be punished for complying with masters' demands or for resisting those demands, where survival required navigating contradictions that were deliberately designed to be unnavigable. Today, more than 180 years after the events of 1843, the location of the Blackwood plantation is a combination of agricultural land and small-town suburban development, and few residents know the history that unfolded there. But the story persists in historical archives, in family oral traditions preserved by the descendants of slaves who witnessed the executions, in the gaps and silences of official records that tried to erase evidence but couldn't completely succeed. The oak tree is gone, but the clearing where it stood still exists, and occasionally people who know the history visit it, leaving flowers or small memorials for 5 men whose names are finally being recovered from the erasure that Harrison Blackwood intended to be complete. Catherine Blackwood's story raises uncomfortable questions about gender, power, and agency under slavery that don't have simple answers. She held power over the men she involved in her affairs, power that made genuine consent impossible. But she also faced consequences for violating social taboos that were rooted in maintaining slavery's racial hierarchy rather than protecting anyone's well-being. The men she involved had no agency, no ability to refuse her advances without facing punishment. Yet they were killed as if they had been the aggressors when the truth emerged. And the entire system, the silence that surrounded the events, the violence that suppressed discussion, the erasure that followed, served to protect not individual morality, but the social order that required racial hierarchy to be seen as natural and inviolable, rather than constructed and fragile. If this story revealed something you never knew about the complexities and horrors of slavery, leave a comment telling us what troubled you most. And if you want more untold stories that challenge comfortable assumptions about American history, subscribe now. These stories matter not just as history but as evidence that the systems we construct to control human beings inevitably produce atrocities. That hierarchies maintained through violence will always sacrifice individuals to preserve institutional power, and that the truth, no matter how thoroughly buried, eventually finds ways to surface through the gaps and silences that attempted erasure always leaves behind. Some believe Harrison Blackwood deserves sympathy as someone trapped in an oppressive marriage who sought connection in the only ways available to her, that her actions, while destructive, represented rebellion against a system that denied white women genuine autonomy. Others insist she was simply a perpetrator who used her racial and class privilege to coerce men who couldn't refuse her, and then escaped punishment while they paid with their lives. What is certain is that 5 men died because a white woman chose to exercise power she held over them, that their death served to restore through violence a sense of racial hierarchy that her actions had threatened, and that the society that executed them and erased Catherine's story did so to protect slavery's foundational lie. That racial difference justified absolute power of one group over another, rather than being an arbitrary characteristic weaponized to maintain exploitative economic systems.